In the quiet Lakewood neighborhood on the south side of Jacksonville, Florida, 8-year-old Maddie Clifton was known as the kind of child who rarely stayed indoors. She was energetic, cheerful, and deeply compassionate in a way that stood out even among other children her age. Maddie lived with her parents and her older sister in a close-knit community where neighbors watched out for one another and children moved freely between homes. She loved sports and spent hours outside playing basketball, tossing balls down the street, or riding her bike with friends. At the same time, she had a softer, creative side. She danced ballet, practiced the piano, and performed on stage with the confidence of someone far older than 8. What truly defined Maddie, according to those who knew her, was her instinct to include others. If she saw a child standing alone or looking uncomfortable, she would approach them without hesitation, introduce herself, and make sure they felt welcome. That sense of kindness extended to many of the neighborhood children, including a boy who lived nearby named Joshua Phillips. Joshua was 14 years old, quiet, and often kept to himself. To many neighbors, he seemed polite and respectful, a teenager who enjoyed reading, spending time on his computer, and caring for his pets. There were no obvious warning signs that would make anyone suspect something darker beneath the surface. Like many teenagers, he appeared somewhat withdrawn, but nothing about his behavior raised serious concern among the families who lived around him. On the afternoon of November 3, 1998, Maddie was outside playing as she usually did. The weather was mild, and the streets of Lakewood were filled with the ordinary sounds of children laughing and neighbors chatting across driveways. That day, Maddie had been hitting golf balls along the road, practicing swings and running back and forth to collect them. Around 5 in the evening, she was still playing outside, moving between houses the way children in the neighborhood often did. Because the community felt safe and familiar, it wasn't unusual for kids to wander a short distance from home as they played. As evening approached, Maddie's mother called for dinner. Her older sister came inside, but Maddie did not. At first, no one panicked. It seemed possible she had simply stopped by another house or lost track of time while playing with friends. But when neighbors began checking with their children and no one had seen her recently, concerns started to grow. Within a short period, the situation shifted from a simple search around the block to something far more serious. Her mother contacted emergency services and reported that her 8-year-old daughter was missing. Officers arrived quickly, asking questions about what Maddie had been wearing and where she had last been seen. According to the family, she had been nearby only a short time earlier, playing in the area right outside their home. But as the minutes passed without any sign of her, the worry deepened. Soon, neighbors began joining the search. Flashlights appeared as daylight faded, and people spread through yards, sidewalks, and nearby streets calling Maddie's name. The sense of unity in the neighborhood was powerful. Many residents later said that Maddie felt like everyone's child, a bright and friendly presence who had touched nearly every family in the area. That night, dozens of people searched together, hoping the little girl would simply walk out from behind a fence or emerge from a friend's house with a sheepish smile. But as the hours passed, that hope slowly began to fade, replaced by a growing fear that something far more troubling had happened. As the search continued into the following days, investigators began carefully examining every possible lead. Officers canvassed the Lakewood neighborhood repeatedly, speaking with residents, checking yards, sheds, and vehicles, and collecting any information that might reveal what had happened during the brief window between the last time Maddie was seen and the moment her family realized she was gone. Federal investigators joined the effort, and a reward was offered for information that could lead to her return. Despite the massive search, there were no immediate signs of a struggle, no clothing left behind, and no clear indication that she had been taken from the neighborhood. For several days, authorities struggled to piece together a timeline without any physical evidence pointing them in a clear direction. That changed on the morning of November 9th, 6 days after Maddie disappeared. Across the street from the Clifton home, the mother of 14-year-old Joshua Phillips entered her son's bedroom to clean up what she described as an unusually messy space. While tidying the room, she noticed moisture around his waterbed and a strong odor that had been lingering in the house for days. Assuming the mattress was leaking, she began removing bedding and lifting parts of the bed frame to inspect it. As she looked underneath the frame, she saw something that immediately caused her to recoil in shock. Hidden beneath the bed was the body of a child. Authorities were called within minutes, and the house quickly became the center of a homicide investigation. According to police reports, Maddie Clifton's body had been concealed under the waterbed frame in Joshua's bedroom since the day she vanished. Crime scene investigators documented extensive evidence within the room, including a baseball bat and a knife believed to have been used during the attack. The medical examiner's autopsy later concluded that Maddie had suffered severe blunt force trauma to the head and multiple stab wounds. Investigators determined that she had been struck several times before eventually dying from the injuries inflicted with the knife. Her clothing had been partially removed, though the examination found no physical evidence of sexual assault. When Joshua Phillips was questioned by detectives in the presence of his parents, he admitted responsibility for Maddie's death. In his recorded statement, he claimed that the incident began as an accident while the two children were playing in the backyard. According to his account, a baseball he struck had hit Maddie in the face, causing her to panic and scream. Fearing punishment from his father, Joshua said he dragged her into the house and struck her with a baseball bat in an attempt to silence her. He told investigators that after placing her under his bed, he later heard her making noises, realized she was still alive, and then used a pocket knife to stab her multiple times. However, prosecutors later pointed out inconsistencies between Joshua's explanation and the physical evidence documented at the scene. Investigators found no blood or signs of injury in the backyard where he claimed the accident occurred. The absence of dirt or debris on Maddie's body also suggested she had not been injured outdoors before entering the bedroom. These details raised serious doubts about the claim that the violence began accidentally. Within days of the discovery, the Duval County grand jury reviewed the case. Joshua Phillips, who was 14 at the time of the crime, was formally indicted for first-degree murder. Prosecutors announced their intention to try him as an adult, arguing that the brutality of the crime and the evidence collected from the scene justified the most serious charge available under Florida law. The case that had begun as a desperate search for a missing child had now become one of the most disturbing homicide investigations the city had ever seen. In the days following the discovery, the story quickly spread beyond Jacksonville and became national news. Television crews lined the quiet residential streets, and reporters documented the disbelief that had settled over the Lakewood community. For nearly a week, the city had been united in a desperate effort to find a missing child. Now the reality was far darker. The girl everyone had been searching for had been hidden just steps away from her own home the entire time. Local news outlets described the emotional scene that unfolded once authorities confirmed the discovery. Neighbors gathered outside, many of them standing silently or holding hands as they tried to process what had happened. Some formed an impromptu prayer circle in the street, while others placed flowers and handwritten notes near the Clifton family's home. For many residents, the shock was overwhelming. The idea that such a brutal crime had occurred in a place they believed was safe left the entire neighborhood shaken. Coverage of the case intensified as more details emerged from investigators. Reports explained how hundreds of volunteers had spent days combing the surrounding area with flashlights, searching yards, wooded areas, storm drains, and nearby ponds. Law enforcement agencies had deployed significant resources, including federal assistance, while the community distributed thousands of missing person flyers featuring Maddie's photograph. In hindsight, the most devastating revelation was that while the entire neighborhood searched for her, her body had been hidden inside the home of a boy many of the volunteers knew personally. News reports also highlighted the unsettling detail that officers had previously entered the Phillips home during the search efforts. Detectives had spoken with family members and even visited Joshua's bedroom, but at the time, nothing immediately pointed them toward the concealed body beneath the bed frame. Investigators later acknowledged that a strange odor had been noticed in the room, though it had initially been attributed to the presence of birds Joshua kept as pets. As the investigation progressed, reporters closely followed the legal developments. Prosecutors confirmed that Joshua Phillips would face a first-degree murder charge, despite being only 14 years old at the time of the crime. Legal analysts discussed the rarity and seriousness of trying such a young suspect as an adult, emphasizing that the decision reflected the extreme nature of the violence involved. The case quickly became a topic of debate across news programs and newspaper editorials, raising difficult questions about juvenile crime, accountability, and how the justice system should respond when a child commits such a devastating act. Coverage also focused heavily on the life of Maddie Clifton. Journalists spoke with teachers, neighbors, and community members who described her as outgoing, compassionate, and unusually thoughtful for her age. Many stories emphasized how she often went out of her way to include other children, especially those who seemed lonely or shy. These recollections deepened the emotional impact of the case, reminding viewers that the tragedy was not just about a crime, but about the loss of a vibrant young life that had brought joy to so many people. As the days passed, the case dominated headlines throughout Florida and beyond. Candlelight vigils were held in Maddie's memory, and residents continued leaving flowers and messages outside the family's home. The story had transformed from a missing child investigation into a heartbreaking reminder of how quickly an ordinary afternoon could turn into an unimaginable tragedy. As the investigation unfolded, interviews with neighbors, investigators, and family members began to paint a deeper emotional picture of the tragedy. People who had lived around the Clifton family described Maddie as the kind of child who naturally brought others together. One neighbor recalled that it was almost impossible to picture the neighborhood without her running through it. She was constantly knocking on doors, asking if children could come outside and play. Parents trusted her, and many said she treated every child like a friend. For those who lived nearby, the loss felt personal because Maddie had been part of their daily lives. Investigators who worked the case also spoke about how deeply the discovery affected the officers involved. One veteran crime scene technician later described the scene inside the bedroom as one of the most disturbing cases he had encountered in years of service. Detectives had spent days searching the area for clues, unaware that the evidence they were looking for was hidden inside a home they had already visited. The realization that the child had been concealed so close to her own house left a lasting impression on many of the officers who worked the investigation. Neighbors who knew Joshua Phillips struggled to reconcile the image of the polite teenager they had interacted with and the violent act he had admitted to committing. Several people explained that he had always appeared respectful and well-mannered. Parents in the neighborhood had allowed their own children to spend time with him, believing he was simply a quiet boy who preferred reading and keeping to himself. Even classmates and teachers reportedly expressed disbelief when his arrest became public, saying there had been nothing in his behavior that hinted at the crime he was accused of. Members of Maddie's family also shared their grief during interviews, describing the painful reality of adjusting to life without her. Her sister spoke about how difficult it was to return to their home after the funeral, where every room seemed to carry memories of the life they once shared. Small routines suddenly became reminders of what had been lost. Something as simple as setting the dinner table now meant realizing there was one place that would remain empty. The silence in the house felt overwhelming in ways that were difficult to explain. Joshua's mother also spoke publicly about the shock that had consumed her family. She described the moment she discovered Maddie's body in her son's bedroom as something she would never be able to forget. In later conversations, she reflected on the guilt and confusion that followed, questioning whether there had been signs she somehow failed to notice. According to her, Joshua had seemed like an ordinary teenager in the days after Maddie disappeared. Aside from being quieter than usual, nothing about his behavior had suggested the truth. Over time, a complicated and unexpected connection formed between the two families. Maddie's sister occasionally reached out to Joshua's mother, recognizing that both women were carrying different forms of grief caused by the same tragedy. Those moments revealed how deeply the crime had affected everyone involved. One family was mourning a child they would never see again, while the other was confronting the unimaginable reality of what their own son had done. As the case moved toward its conclusion, the courtroom became the place where the community's grief and anger finally met the legal process. Prosecutors argued that the evidence showed a deliberate and violent killing, while the defense tried to portray the tragedy as a panicked act by a frightened teenager. According to the defense, Joshua Phillips had grown up in a home where he constantly feared punishment from his father, and that fear had spiraled into irrational decisions once Maddie was injured. They suggested the events began as an accident that escalated when he panicked and tried to hide what had happened. The prosecution rejected that explanation, pointing to the physical evidence and the severity of the injuries. Investigators testified that there was no sign Maddie had been injured outside, as Joshua claimed, and the pattern of wounds indicated a sustained attack rather than a single moment of panic. They also emphasized that after the violence, Joshua concealed her body beneath his bed and continued living normally while the entire neighborhood searched for the missing girl. For 6 days, volunteers and law enforcement officers walked past the house, unaware that the child they were desperately trying to find was hidden inside. After hearing the testimony and reviewing the evidence, the jury reached a verdict that would change the course of Joshua Phillips's life permanently. He was found guilty of first-degree murder. Because of the seriousness of the crime, the court sentenced him to life in prison without the possibility of parole. At 15 years old, he entered the prison system with a sentence that meant he would likely spend the rest of his life behind bars. Years later, the legal landscape surrounding juvenile sentencing in the United States began to change. In 2012, a Supreme Court ruling determined that mandatory life sentences without parole for juveniles were unconstitutional in many circumstances. That decision opened the door for individuals who had been sentenced as minors to return to court for new hearings. As a result, Joshua Phillips's case was reviewed again nearly 2 decades after the murder. During the resentencing proceedings, members of Maddie's family addressed the court and spoke about the lasting impact of the crime. They described the milestones that Maddie would never experience: graduations, a wedding, children of her own. For them, the passage of time had not erased the loss. It had simply made the absence more visible as the years went on. Joshua also addressed the court, expressing remorse and acknowledging the pain he had caused. Ultimately, the judge ruled that his life sentence would remain in place, but would include the possibility of a review after he had served 25 years. That decision ensured he would remain incarcerated while still leaving open the possibility of future reconsideration. Decades after the crime, the case continues to move through the legal system as courts review whether his sentence should ever be modified. Cases like this force people to confront uncomfortable questions about human behavior, especially when the person responsible is so young. An 8-year-old child lost her life in an act of violence that shocked an entire city, and a 14-year-old boy became the person responsible for that loss. What makes the case particularly haunting is how ordinary everything appeared on the surface. The neighborhood was close-knit, the families knew one another, and the children played freely between houses. Nothing about that environment suggested it would become the setting for such a devastating tragedy. One of the most difficult aspects of the case is the lingering question of why it happened. Even after confessions, trials, and years of reflection, there is still no single explanation that fully answers it. Joshua's account described panic and fear after an accident, while prosecutors believed the evidence suggested something more deliberate. Over time, discussions about his upbringing and the environment inside his home have been raised as possible influences, but explanations are not the same as answers. For Maddie's family, the absence of a clear reason has remained one of the most painful parts of the story. Another unsettling detail is how the crime unfolded in the middle of a community that believed it was safe. While neighbors searched through the streets calling Maddie's name, the truth was hidden inside a house they walked past countless times. That realization left many residents struggling with the idea that danger does not always come from strangers. Sometimes it exists quietly within familiar spaces, making tragedies like this especially difficult for communities to process. At the same time, the case also revealed something powerful about the people affected by it. The support shown to Maddie's family in the days after her disappearance demonstrated how deeply one child's life had touched those around her. The vigils, the memorials, and the continued remembrance of her name all reflect the lasting impact she had despite her young age. Maddie was remembered not only for the tragedy that took her life, but also for the kindness she showed to others while she was here. The long legal journey that followed has raised broader conversations about justice and juvenile accountability. Some people believe the severity of the crime demands lifelong imprisonment, while others argue that children who commit crimes may still be capable of change after decades behind bars. Those debates are difficult, and there are no simple answers. What remains constant, however, is the reality that Maddie's life ended far too soon, and nothing that happens in court can restore what her family lost. In the end, this case is remembered not only for the horror of the crime, but also for the reminder it leaves behind. A small act of kindness, an 8-year-old girl knocking on a neighbor's door to include someone she thought might be lonely, was meant to bring friendship. Instead, it led to a tragedy that forever changed 2 families and an entire community. And perhaps that contrast between innocence and violence is what makes the story so difficult to forget.